This year. Yeah, the first one will be February 8th. And we have wonderful new artists to expect here. Trace Atkins, of course, some of us have been around.
Country music has always asked its women to play a role. Be wholesome, be loyal, be graceful. Sing about love, but never live it too loudly. For decades, female country stars were held to a standard no man in the genre ever faced, their private lives treated as public property and moral test cases. Relationships that would barely dent a male artist's career became career-threatening scandals when women were involved. Headlines turned personal choices into character judgments. Radio went silent. Labels grew distant. Fans felt betrayed by lives they believed they owned. Tonight's story isn't about rumors. It's about how visibility itself became dangerous. 10 female country stars were vilified not for breaking laws, but for breaking expectations, and the consequences followed them for years, long after the headlines faded. Before a single song ever reached radio, female country artists were taught an unspoken rule: image comes first. Nashville didn't just sign voices, it signed values. Young women entering the industry were packaged as symbols of wholesomeness, marketed as daughters, wives, or future mothers long before they were treated as musicians. Contracts included morality clauses that were vague but powerful, allowing labels to distance themselves if an artist's personal life threatened the brand. Managers coached interviews carefully, steering conversations away from dating, independence, or anything that hinted at autonomy. Fans were encouraged to see these women not just as entertainers, but as role models whose lives reflected the lyrics they sang. And for a while, it worked. The illusion held. But it came at a cost. These women were expected to grow up under surveillance, every appearance scrutinized, every friendship questioned, every rumor magnified. Dating quietly became a survival skill. Privacy wasn't a right. It was a risk. When relationships did surface, the response was immediate and unforgiving. Words like reckless, unstable, and out of control appeared in headlines where male artists would have been called passionate or complicated. The message was clear: love was allowed, but only if it fit the script. Step outside it, and the punishment followed. Some artists were warned privately to keep relationships hidden or risk losing radio support. Others were encouraged to reshape their public image overnight. More faith, more family talk, fewer personal details. The pressure wasn't just professional, it was psychological. Living under constant judgment taught many of these women to second-guess normal human choices. They learned that visibility invited consequences, and silence offered protection. The good girl image wasn't just branding, it was a cage. And the moment cracks appeared, the industry reacted not with understanding, but with distance. Because once the illusion broke, there was no easy way to put it back together. And when the first widely reported relationships became public, the backlash revealed just how fragile these careers really were. The moment private relationships crossed into public view, the tone changed instantly. What had once been quiet speculation became loud judgment. A single photo leaving a restaurant, a candid shot at an airport, a name confirmed by a tabloid headline, and suddenly, a woman's entire career was reframed around who she was dating instead of what she had created. The media didn't ask whether these relationships were healthy or consensual. It asked whether they were appropriate. Female country stars were no longer musicians in these stories. They were cautionary tales. Headlines framed normal adult relationships as recklessness, instability, or moral failure. The language was sharp, personal, and relentless. Comment sections filled with accusations of betrayal from fans who felt entitled to an artist's private life. Radio hosts debated character instead of music. Morning shows shifted from promotion to interrogation. Meanwhile, male artists in similar situations faced little more than curiosity, sometimes even praise. The imbalance was impossible to miss. Some women tried to ignore the noise, believing the music would speak louder. It didn't. Once a narrative took hold, it followed them everywhere. Interviews became hostile. Questions circled back to personal choices, no matter how often they were deflected. One artist watched a planned album rollout stall because press coverage fixated on her relationship instead of her work. Another was advised by management to lay low until public interest faded, a polite way of saying disappear. The most damaging part wasn't the exposure, it was the framing. These women weren't portrayed as adults making decisions. They were portrayed as liabilities endangering the genre's image. Fans who once sang along now questioned authenticity, as if love disqualified talent. The pressure to explain themselves was constant, but explanation rarely helped. Defending their choices was labeled defensive. Silence was labeled guilt. Either way, the damage spread. Sponsors hesitated. Booking agents became cautious. Even collaborators worried association might invite scrutiny. What had started as personal relationships quickly became professional threats. And as the stories multiplied, the industry didn't step in to protect its artists. It stepped back, because distance was safer than defense. The message was unmistakable. Visibility came at a price, and women paid it first. And just as some believed the attention might eventually fade, the situation escalated again. This time with consequences no apology could undo. Once the backlash reached a certain volume, the industry responded the way it always does when risk appears, quietly. There were no public statements, no official condemnations. Instead, doors began to close without explanation. Songs that had been climbing radio charts suddenly stalled. Singles stopped being added to playlists. Program directors claimed rotation changes or audience feedback, but no one said the real reason out loud. Labels held internal meetings where names were discussed not in terms of talent, but in terms of exposure. Publicists shifted strategies from promotion to containment. Interviews were canceled under vague pretenses. Festival lineups were adjusted, sometimes days before announcements went public. For the artists caught in the middle, the shift was immediate and disorienting. One week they were being praised for authenticity. The next, they were advised to keep a low profile and avoid public appearances. Management teams framed it as protection, but the message was clear. Visibility had become dangerous. These women weren't accused of crimes. They hadn't broken laws. Yet they were treated as liabilities simply for not conforming to the image the genre demanded. What made this moment especially cruel was the lack of clarity. No one told them directly what they'd done wrong. There was no formal punishment to appeal, no timeline for forgiveness, just silence. Calls went unanswered. Opportunities slowed. The machine that once amplified their voices now acted like it didn't hear them at all. Fans noticed the absence, but were rarely told why. Some assumed the artists had chosen to step back. Others moved on without question. Inside Nashville, the lesson was absorbed quickly. Younger artists watched closely, learning that personal lives were not just private matters. They were career variables to be managed carefully. Dating quietly became a rule, not a preference. Openness became a gamble. For those already under scrutiny, the pressure intensified. Any misstep risked confirming the narrative being built around them. Some tried to overcorrect, reshaping their public personas overnight. Others withdrew completely, hoping time would soften the damage. But once momentum is lost in country music, it is rarely regained. And for a few of these women, this wasn't just a slowdown, it was the beginning of the end. When the silence stretched on, the reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a temporary pause, it was a slow erasure. Tours that once sold out easily were downsized, then quietly canceled. Opening acts were reassigned. Headlining slots disappeared. Artists who had been staples on award show stages found themselves watching from home as invitations stopped arriving. Financial pressure followed quickly. Without radio support, streaming numbers dipped. Without visibility, merch sales slowed. Advances that once came automatically were suddenly under review. Managers spoke in careful language, urging patience while privately preparing for long-term damage. Some artists tried to fight back by releasing new music, believing that quality would override controversy. It rarely did. Songs were ignored not because they weren't good, but because the industry had already moved on. Others attempted public apologies, hoping vulnerability would restore trust. But apologies placed them in an impossible position. Say too little and be accused of avoiding accountability. Say too much and be labeled dramatic or manipulative. There was no winning version. What made this phase especially brutal was how isolating it became. Collaborators hesitated to attach their names. Producers grew cautious. Friends in the industry stopped reaching out, not out of malice, but fear of association. Even longtime supporters advised stepping away from the spotlight for a while, though no one could say how long that while would last. For some women, the pressure led to anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of shame. They began to question their instincts, their worth, their right to exist publicly at all. The relationships that triggered the backlash often ended under this strain, leaving them alone with consequences they hadn't anticipated. And still, the narrative followed them. Every new appearance, every interview, every lyric was filtered through past headlines. They were no longer evaluated as artists, but as reputations. In Nashville, reputation is currency. Once it drops, rebuilding is almost impossible. A few artists made the painful decision to step away voluntarily, telling the public it was for personal reasons while privately knowing the choice had been made for them. Others held on, hoping persistence would eventually be rewarded. But by the time this stage arrived, many careers were already beyond saving. And that divide, between those who disappeared and those who somehow survived, revealed something far more unsettling about the industry itself. The difference between the women whose careers collapsed and those who managed to remain standing had little to do with talent or remorse. It came down to power, timing, and whether the industry decided they were still worth protecting. Nashville has always operated on quiet calculations. If an artist could still sell tickets, move records, or bring prestige to a label, there was room for patience. If not, the patience vanished overnight. Some women were advised to disappear strategically. No interviews, no social media, no visible relationships, until the narrative cooled. Others were never offered that option. Their scandals arrived at moments when labels were already shifting priorities, making them easy to sacrifice. Gender amplified every consequence. Male artists with similar or worse personal controversies were framed as flawed, complex, or in need of growth. Female artists were framed as cautionary examples. Their behavior was dissected for morality rather than context. One woman watched a male peer rebound within a year with a redemption story centered on faith and personal growth, while she remained locked out of radio for far less. The message was absorbed quickly across the genre. Women were expected to embody the values country music sang about, not just perform them. Breaking that illusion carried a heavier cost. Behind closed doors, executives acknowledged it, but rarely challenged it. The system had been built this way for decades. For the women still trying to survive, choices narrowed. Reinvention became less about creativity and more about damage control. Some leaned into songwriting roles, stepping away from the spotlight. Others shifted genres or markets, hoping distance would dilute memory. A few were told directly that their best option was time, years of it. Enough for fans to forget why they were upset in the first place. But time doesn't erase stigma equally. Even when opportunities returned, they came with conditions. Smaller stages, less promotion, shorter leashes. These women weren't welcomed back as equals. They were allowed back cautiously. And for those who never made it back at all, the lesson lingered like a warning sign for every artist watching from the sidelines. In country music, the punishment was rarely official, but it was always effective. And the emotional toll of that imbalance would follow these women long after the headlines stopped printing their names. When the music slowed and the phones stopped ringing, the real consequences began to surface. Careers can be rebuilt, but public judgment leaves marks that don't fade with time. For many of these women, the backlash didn't end when headlines moved on. It followed them into every part of life. Trust became harder. Relationships felt riskier. Even stepping outside invited scrutiny they never asked for. Some spoke quietly about anxiety that lingered long after tours ended, about second-guessing every decision because they had learned how quickly approval could turn into punishment. Others chose isolation, shrinking their worlds to protect what remained of their peace. The irony was painful. The same industry that demanded authenticity had taught them to hide. They became experts at privacy, not because they wanted secrecy, but because openness had proven dangerous. A few women found new purpose away from the spotlight, writing for others, mentoring younger artists, building lives that didn't depend on applause. But even then, the past lingered. Introductions still carried footnotes. Achievements were still framed through old narratives. Some artists admitted they stopped talking about love entirely, unwilling to give the public anything else to judge. What hurt most was the sense of disposability. Years of dedication, success, and influence reduced to a single storyline they never controlled. Fans often assumed these women fell off or lost relevance, never seeing how deliberately they were pushed aside. And inside Nashville, their stories became cautionary examples, unspoken reminders of what happens when expectations are broken. Younger artists listened closely. They learned to guard their personal lives, to separate the woman from the brand, to choose silence over honesty if forced to pick. The cycle continued quietly, reinforced by fear rather than rules. These women paid a price not just with their careers, but with their confidence, their trust, and their sense of safety in a world that once promised them everything. And while some eventually found stability again, the cost of that stability was clear. They had to live smaller, quieter, and far more carefully than the men who made the same choices without consequence. Over time, the damage extended beyond individual careers and settled into the foundation of the genre itself. Country music prides itself on storytelling, honesty, and lived experience, yet it quietly taught its female artists that telling the truth about their own lives was too dangerous. Love had to be implied, never explored. Pain had to be sung, never lived out loud. The result was a generation of women who learned to separate their art from their reality, writing songs about authenticity while carefully curating a version of themselves that would survive public approval. This didn't just hurt the artists, it reshaped the music. Songs became safer, narratives narrowed, risk disappeared. Where raw confession once could have lived, restraint took its place. Younger artists watched what happened to the women before them and adapted accordingly. They hid relationships. They avoided visibility. They learned that silence was protection, not weakness. Nashville benefited from the illusion of stability, but it came at a cost few wanted to acknowledge. The genre lost stories it never heard. It lost voices that learned not to speak freely. It lost the chance to evolve honestly. Meanwhile, male artists continued to write openly about mistakes, regrets, and complicated love lives, often celebrated for their vulnerability. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was structural. Fans absorbed it without being told. They learned what kinds of honesty were rewarded and which were punished. Over time, the double standard became normalized, almost invisible, woven into expectations rather than enforced by rules. Even now, echoes of those decisions remain. Female artists still tread carefully. Public relationships are managed. Personal revelations are timed, softened, or avoided altogether. The women who were vilified became warnings instead of lessons learned. Their experiences weren't used to build a fairer system. They were used to reinforce caution. And that may be the most lasting consequence of all. Not the stalled careers, not the canceled tours, but the quiet agreement that some truths are better left unsung. Country music protected its image, but in doing so, it asked its women to carry the burden of that protection alone. And when history looks back, it may find that the genre's greatest loss wasn't scandal or controversy. It was honesty. What rarely made headlines was what happened after the backlash faded. When the tours slowed, when radio moved on, when the internet found a new target, these women were left, alone with consequences no chart position could measure. Anxiety lingered long after apologies were issued. Trust became fragile. Many admitted privately that they began to doubt their own instincts, not because they had done something wrong, but because punishment taught them that visibility itself was dangerous. Relationships became harder, not easier. Some avoided dating publicly at all, terrified of becoming another headline. Others stayed in unhealthy situations longer than they should have, afraid that another breakup would reinforce a narrative they never chose. The shame wasn't always loud. It was quiet, creeping into daily decisions. How much to share, what to post, who to trust. Even music, once a refuge, became complicated. Writing honestly meant risking judgment. Holding back meant losing authenticity. Some artists described feeling split in two, the woman living her life and the version of herself allowed to exist publicly. That divide took a toll on mental health. Confidence eroded. Depression surfaced. A few stepped away entirely, not because they lost love for music, but because the cost of staying visible felt too high. What hurt most was the isolation. Fans often assumed these women were fine, successful, wealthy, resilient. Few saw how deeply public judgment reshaped their sense of safety. They learned to be guarded in a world that once promised celebration. Even years later, introductions still came with qualifiers, achievements still framed through old stories. Healing, when it came, happened slowly and privately. Not through redemption arcs or comeback headlines, but through rebuilding trust in themselves. The emotional cost wasn't a moment. It was a long aftermath that followed them quietly, long after the industry declared the issue resolved. When the full picture comes into focus, the legacy of these stories isn't scandal, it's absence. Country music protected its image by discouraging honesty, and in doing so, it lost, voices it never fully heard. These 10 women weren't punished for breaking rules written on paper. They were punished for breaking expectations that were never spoken out loud. The genre asked them to embody ideals that left no room for complexity, growth, or normal human behavior. Some adapted, some disappeared, some stayed but learned to live smaller. And that adaptation reshaped the genre itself. Songs became safer, stories narrower, risk replaced by caution. Meanwhile, the double standard remained, quietly teaching new generations the same lesson. Truth is celebrated only when it doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. The industry moved forward, but not unchanged. The silence these women were pushed into became part of the system. Normalized, inherited, rarely questioned. Yet their impact didn't vanish. It lives in the artists who learned from them, in the boundaries women now set, in the careful ways personal lives are still managed today. If country music is, at its heart, about storytelling, then these untold stories matter. They reveal not just how careers were nearly ended, but how authenticity was constrained by fear. In the end, the tragedy isn't that these women had private lives, it's that they were punished for living them honestly. And until the genre is willing to reckon with that truth, it will continue to sing about real life while quietly asking its women to hide theirs.